parish priest in Carniola. Amnik is an ancient city with a history that goes far. Back into the Middle Ages, the massive walls surrounding the older section with their 4 gates and lookout towers were built in 1451 as a defense against the invading Turks. The parish church of Kamnik is almost as old as the city itself. It was founded during the time of the Crusades and is the mother church of many parishes of that region. There is a picturesque quality about Kamnik, a curious blending of ancient with modern, that makes it a favorite rendezvous for tourists. It is only a short ride by railroad from Ljubljana, the capital, situated in the foothills of the Alps. A river which takes its name from the city runs along its outskirts. On one side of Kamnik towers Krizna Gora, topped by the ruins of an ancient castle. Within, the enclosure of the walls themselves rises another but smaller mountain, more a steep hill than anything else, which, too, is surmounted by a ruined castle, Maligrad. This eminence gives its distinctive appearance to the town, dividing it into 2 sections. In 1882, a tunnel was built to connect them. Once Kamnik was the second city in importance in the entire province, being outranked only by Ljubljana. Its favorable location made it the political and economic center of the whole of northeastern Carniola. All commercial traffic converged here, and it was the scene of a brisk provincial trade in livestock and produce. But its importance diminished with the construction of highways and railways, which have rendered the capital more accessible to the rural inhabitants who in a former day would have made Kamnik their stopping place. However, it is still popular with appreciative travelers for its rugged mountain scenery and the quaint century-old customs of the native peasantry. Here, on November 20th, 1785, Francis Xavier Piers was born. The parental home, which stood hard by the old town wall but outside it, is no longer there, having been destroyed in the Great Fire that swept Kamnik in 1804. It seems more than a mere coincidence that his devout parents gave the name of the great Jesuit missionary St. Francis Xavier to this child, their eldest son, who was to bring such renown to them and to his native land by the heroism of his apostolic labors among the Indians of North America. His family appears to have been of modest circumstances, as is so often the case with the Catholic peasantry of Europe. It was blessed with few of the superfluous goods of this world, but was amply compensated by the richness of faith which permeated all its members. God blessed this pious home with 3 priests. Francis Xavier was ordained in 1813, a brother, John, was ordained in 1815, and another brother, Simon, sometime later. 3. How many other children there were in the Piers household is not certain. The evidence at hand indicates at least 2 others. Piers in his letters frequently mentions a sister, Apollonia, whom he calls by the pet name of Polona. She was married and lived in Podbrege, which was her brother's last pastoral charge in Carniola. There must also have been another brother, for a son of his, Bartholomew, came to America in 1854. Bishop Baraga took an interest in this boy, who was then already a theology student, and provided him with a letter of recommendation to Archbishop Purcell of Cincinnati, asking the latter to receive him into the seminary. He seems to have been accepted by the archbishop, but he did not persevere in his studies, and now drops out of the picture altogether. There is very little that can be told of Father Pierce's childhood and boyhood. Except for a few bare facts about his schooling, nothing definite has come down to us. However, we can reasonably assume that his early life was the typical one of a boy in rural Carniola. Since his parents were by no means well-to-do and he was the eldest son, young Pierre soon learned responsibility and the importance of adding his share, however small it might be, to the family purse. He probably took his turn with the other boys of Kamnik in driving the cows to pasture. This was once a common chore for the Slovene country boy. The families which had some means usually owned a cow or 2, and these would be herded together and taken to graze by a group of boys. Sometimes, too, the local count, or a wealthy landowner, would hire the lads to drive his prize herds to pasture. This was a much sought-after job, and the boys vied with one another to obtain it. For their work they might receive a crown, or even 2, each week 3, not a great amount, but at least giving the boys a feeling of sharing their parents' burden. The work itself was not hard. Indeed, to hear the old-timers reminisce, those who actually lived such a boyhood readily receives the impression that it was an exciting experience. The writer recalls with what fascination he used to listen to the stories told him by his father of the fun he had as a boy in Carniola. The cows required only a minimum of herding, and once the young herdsmen reached the pasture, they usually had the day to themselves. Swimming and splashing about in the river was a favorite diversion. Fishing, catching crabs, picking fruits and berries, gathering nuts, all helped to fill the summer days. Occasionally, a wild boar chase enlivened the scene. Completely unmindful of the peril involved in such a foolhardy sport, the boys would tear after the dangerous beast whenever they happened to come upon one feeding peace, fully on nuts. But all was not pastoral work and play. When he was old enough, young Francis Pierce enrolled in the elementary school conducted by the Franciscans in Kamnik. It was the municipal school and under the supervision of the government, even though it was staffed by religious teachers. Here, for the first time, he came into direct contact with the oppressive ruling policy that characterized Austria's relations with her subject nationalities. As one Yugoslav historian has observed, the very existence of the empire depended on suppression of all subject nationalities, and it made every effort to denationalize them. In Slovenia, for example, Germanization began in the Middle Ages. German colonists built churches and monasteries. A German aristocracy developed, and with it a Germanized Slovene aristocracy. The Slovenes became more and more dependent upon the Germans who guided their destinies right down to 1918. In accordance with this policy, then, Pierce studied the elementary subjects in German. This was the official language not only of the provincial government but also of the schools. Slovenian was verboten as a dangerous manifestation of nationalism. The Habsburgs maintained a very tenuous hold upon their empire. They had to be constantly on the watch for revolutionary tendencies and were unable to enjoy any measure of security. This fact was only too obvious in their ruling policy. On the one hand, they wished to strengthen the bond between the throne and the people, yet they would not permit the very things which would bring this about. Thus, for example, they feared that toleration of even such universal and human aspirations as the use of the mother tongue in the schools would weaken their authority. The result was complete alienation of most of the minority groups, among whom the prevailing intense dislike of the Habsburg rule was regarded as patriotism of the highest type. Openly, they paid lip service, but secretly, they awaited the opportunity to throw off the shackles. This came with the ascendancy of Napoleon Bonaparte to power in France. The latter made his appearance on the scene at a propitious time in history. One historian appraises the situation as follows. At precisely the right moment, Napoleon, with his peculiar genius, appeared, gradually rose to supreme power, gave France 2 decades of glory both in domestic and foreign affairs, and then gave her the humiliation of a decisive defeat. It was not the time alone, nor the character of the man, which produced the Napoleonic era, but rather a combination of both. Socioeconomic factors and revolutionary idealism created the situation, and the character of the man enabled him to harness its forces for a time. Historically, the Napoleonic era marked the transition from 18th to 19th century socio-political institutions, the last of the benevolent autocrats. He was at the same time the first great example of the modern statesman. Revolution, with disaster and ruin in its wake, had left France a shambles. Society was completely disrupted, and French prestige abroad was practically nil. It is no wonder, then, that the people acclaimed Napoleon as a savior. Capitalizing this popular feeling, he not only brought France completely under his dominion, but swept the horizon with ambitious eye for wider conquests. He envisioned a closely welded United States of Europe. Though they are scattered, there are in Europe more than 30 million Frenchmen, 15 million Spaniards, 15 million Italians, and 30 million Germans. I should like to have made each of these peoples as a single united nation. This, he insisted, had long been his ultimate aim. All the wars he had fought had been forced upon him in order to shatter his dream. Austria's very heterogeneity made her vulnerable, and she was marked as one of the first targets in Napoleon's plan of conquest. She was defeated in 1805. 4 years later, she attempted to liberate herself but failed, and this time she was forced to enter into a humiliating alliance with the Corsican. More than that, Napoleon demanded the hand of the emperor's daughter, Marie-Louise, in marriage in order to provide the French throne with a male heir. French troops occupied Austria and her provinces, and the people experienced a new kind of rule. The initial conquest policy was calculated to win over the people, and for this reason was extremely liberal. To cite only one instance, Napoleon ingratiated himself with the Slovenes when he permitted the restoration of their language and allowed it to be taught in the schools on a par with French. This was a shrewd tactical move, and the people responded to it by applying themselves with vigor to the mastery of French, if, for no other reason, at least to show their appreciation. This accounts for the fact that so many of the Slovene missionaries who labored in America had a working knowledge of the French language, and so were in a decidedly advantageous position when it came to dealing with French settlers and half-breeds. The period of wooing, however, soon came to an end. Napoleon had no serious intention of continuing his liberal policy. This was especially obvious in his relations with the church. Never one to let religion stand in the way of his plans. In ambitions, he had no scruples about imposing restrictive measures, which could have had no other object than to stifle ecclesiastical life completely. Under the new regime, the diocesan seminary of Ljubljana almost ceased to exist. Formerly supported by the religious fund, by endowments, and by the annual contributions of the parishes, it could hardly function on any grand scale, for example, with the 3,600 francs which the provisional government granted it to maintain 30 seminarians for the year 1811. The first two sources of income mentioned above were completely taken over by the French occupation regime for its own purposes. But this was not all. The latter also claimed the right of determining the number of students to be ordained, and for the entire province of Carniola the figure was set at 6 per year. This imposed a real hardship upon the church, and the need for priests to take care of all the spiritual needs of the province was a serious problem which the bishops of this period had to face. The situation was aggravated by the exodus of many of the older priests to Austria, where conditions were somewhat better. At least the annoying restrictions were not enforced there, and pastors still received a regular salary from the government and retained considerable freedom in the exercise of their duties. All the holy days except 5 were likewise abolished. One of those which escaped the edict was the Feast of the Assumption, but only because it happened to coincide with the birthday of the Emperor Napoleon. Under date of December 1, 1811, Bishop Antonius Kautschitz of Ljubljana issued a pastoral letter in which he dispensed the faithful of his jurisdiction from the obligation of hearing Mass on that day, since they would be compelled to listen to the sermon glorifying Napoleon, which was to be preached by order of the emperor. Such was the state of affairs in Carniola when Francis Pierret enrolled in the seminary of Ljubljana in the fall of 1810 to begin his studies for the priesthood. 3 years later, on March 13, 1813, he was ordained by Bishop Kautschitz. He was then 28 years old. Father Pierce's first assignments were to the mountain parishes of Kranjska Gora and Fuzin. Here he worked as an assistant for 7 years. Being of the same sturdy stock as the people whom he served, he was no stranger to their needs, whether spiritual or temporal. So impressed were his superiors by what he accomplished that he was appointed in 1820 to the pastorate of peace. Here he was on his own for the first time, and could do at last all the things that his priestly heart yearned to do. His education and his office made him the leading man in the village, and he was all things to all men, priest, legal counsel, physician, and teacher of improved farming methods, particularly fruit culture. Peace offered a challenge to whatever resourcefulness the young priest had. The village was small, and its inhabitants were poor farmers who barely eked out an existence from their little plots of land. A number of factors must be considered in order to explain the situation completely. The Napoleonic invasion of Carniola in 1810, for instance, which is so often advanced as the cause, was at most only a partial one. True it is that the French troops laid waste field after field of grain, a real tragedy to the majority of the peasant farmers, who were dependent upon these crops for their entire yearly income. But the crux of the problem lay much deeper. We know that the condition of poverty persisted even after peace and order had been restored. An ignorance of the best methods of agriculture seems to be the more logical explanation. The people, intent upon making the best possible living from their farms, often failed to take. Horodek. Agriculture was not something alien to him. Time for the planting. They were primarily interested in the immediate yield and were willing to chance putting all their land into one or two grain crops. This was a risky procedure. Crop failure inevitably spelled ruin, with wretched poverty in its wake. Father Pierce quickly sized up the situation and set out to remedy it. Agriculture was not something alien to him. For years he had given his every spare moment to the study of this science, and he prided himself on the results he had achieved through experimentation. His special forte was the culture of fruits, and he was firmly convinced that the planting of orchards was the answer to his people's problem. An annual fruit harvest would supplement their regular crops, thus reducing very considerably the possibility of total loss. It was easier to state this fact, however, than to convince his parishioners of it. They admitted the urgency of the problem which faced them. They listened respectfully to all their pastors' arguments. But habit and custom, centuries old, had fixed them in their ways. Few were willing to compromise with change. Only after he himself had set out an orchard on parish property and showed them in tangible results that they could succeed in fruit growing did they unbend. Word of the success of Father Pierce's agricultural experimentation at Peace spread rapidly throughout the province. Other villages confronted with the same economic situation followed suit and found that his plan was workable. What had started out as the solution of a local problem was gradually adopted as the land policy of Carniola. Overnight, Pierce found himself something of an authority in the field, and his methods of improved farming an accepted standard. The young priest's heart was gladdened by the turn which events had taken. He had always been deeply interested in the social and economic betterment of his people. He regretted the ignorance of the peasant farmers in regard to soil culture, even while he realized that the blame was not theirs. They were not an indolent people. For centuries they had struggled with the soil as they found it, receiving the while very little or no outside help. The government did nothing to promote scientific farming. If a human standard of living was to be realized, the initiative would have to come from another quarter. Hence he himself undertook the study of farming and gardening. What he learned he shared, not only with his parishioners, but far beyond the limits of his parish. He lectured on these subjects wherever he was invited. But the task was far too great for one man, and he sought other means to disseminate the information. He wrote a handbook explaining the science of fruit culture, Kransky Verinar, which was published in 1830 by the Carniolan Agricultural Society, and even today is considered the standard guide for the fruit grower in Carniola. He was also responsible for the organization throughout the province of agricultural and horticultural societies, whose primary purpose was to assist the farmers in the solution of their particular land problems. Father Pierce never lost his interest in scientific farming. Even after he came to America, he was constantly on the watch for improved methods of soil culture so that he could write back to his friends in Europe and recommend them for local experimentation. In appreciation of his many benefactions to the farmers of Carniola, the Carniolan Agricultural Society awarded him in 1842 a special Medal of Honor.